We turn now to some other important doctrinal developments in the 19th century. We've already highlighted the rise of liberal Protestantism, and one key component of it is what's known as higher criticism. In the middle of the 19th century, a school of thought developed in Germany that essentially attempted to take evolutionary thoughts and apply it to the biblical text. And so if human beings evolved over time, well, the Bible and religion must have evolved over time as well. Now, certainly previous generations had seen individuals be critical of the text. For example, Erasmus, right? He compared manuscripts to try and find the best reading, which is the most likely reading in cases where there are some differences among manuscripts. This is referred to as textual criticism. But beginning in the 18th century, there was this kind of additional push for critical approaches to the Bible. And so you see the rise of biblical archaeology, people trying to do excavations and other archaeological digs and things like that to find evidence of people and places referenced in the Bible, whether that's in the book of Acts or in things related to the conquest. But there was also the question of whether the texts themselves were single products of one author or whether they had been constructed by various people over a period of time. Did they too evolve? And so this idea of the evolving or the evolution of biblical text became known as higher criticism. Scholars, particularly in Germany, sought to identify these sources, and how these things developed. And so you have the development of theories that, Old Testament writers borrowed from other ancient Near East stories and scriptures. The Babylonian myths make it into the creation accounts of and the flood. Egyptian texts make their way into the story of Joseph. Right. So there's this assumption that these authors who are constructing the biblical documents are not recording history, but are bringing in other myths. Now, there's good reason to suggest that that's, not all the way likely. That it's probably not, Moses borrowing from ancient Babylonian sources, even though there's quite a bit of similarity. But this is the supposition. And one place where this particularly found fruit was in looking at the first 5 books of the Bible, the Pentateuch. A man named Julius Wellhausen develops a theory about the Pentateuch that it was actually the composition of several different authors. And there were 4 documents that were kind of interwoven over time to create the Pentateuch as we know it today. And this had to do with, there's different names in the Pentateuch for God. Some call him Elohim in the Hebrew, others call him Yahweh in different passages. And so this led Wellhausen and others to say, well, there must be different texts here. One that specifically refers to Elohim and Elohim alone, and another that specifically refers to Yahweh and Yahweh alone. Right? There isn't this mix and match. Well, again, that's the evidence for that, or the hypothesis for that doesn't hold water. And furthermore, none of these sources that are supposedly behind these documents, right, this idea that it's stitched together over time, none of that has ever been found. And actually in more modern years, this documentary hypothesis about where the Pentateuch came from is fallen out of favor. But the idea that it's of multiple sources is still prominent for a lot of people. And so these things start in Germany, eventually make their way to English and American seminaries. And, we're talking here about the challenges to traditional views of the Bible's construction and how we got the Bible. This kind of finds favor with a lot of those liberal Protestants who are already accepting evolution and modernism and things like that. And so they continue on into higher criticism, feeling that it's a more scientific approach to the Bible. But conservatives, on the other hand, denounce it and are really concerned about what kind of impact is this going to have on Christianity? And once again, as we look at it, the conservatives appear to have gotten it right. This would have a very difficult, almost disastrous effect on Christianity. This, historical critical approach, kind of being suspicious of biblical texts and assuming that there's something else behind it, and this disdain for irrational religiosity, and the use of reason and all these things also leads to what's been known as the quest for the historical Jesus. There's interest that people in the 19th century begin to have in trying to recover the Jesus of history that stands behind the Gospels of the Bible. Now, what's being assumed here is that this Jesus, the historical Jesus, is somebody different from the Christ of the Gospels. Now, why is this something people are wanting to do? Because they don't believe in miracles. The miracles of the Bible, including the resurrection, are assumed to have been made up. These are superstitions. Miracles just don't happen scientifically. And so there's no way, they think, that people could could honestly believe these stories to be true. And so there must have been a historical Jesus that these things were based on. And that's what they become interested in. And so the assumption here is that Jesus of Nazareth is different from the Jesus of Nazareth presented in the Gospels. One of the first people to propose this theory is a man named Herman Reimarus. And his thought essentially is trying to find what Jesus actually said and did, and not just what his followers said he said and did. Again, there are no documents that have ever been discovered that are different from the Gospels, in the sense of, here's a story of Jesus that isn't claiming him to be Christ, especially in the context of the Bible. Now, certainly there are a lot of lost Gospels, so to speak, these other documents from a variety of Christian and heretical Christian groups. But Reimarus seems to think that he's going to look at the Gospels, and somehow the Gospel writers have added all this stuff to Jesus, and he can break through it and find who Jesus really is. And so he took this notion of Jesus being a Jew, situating in the Judaism of his time, and thinking that he preached a Jewish notion of the kingdom of God. But when that failed, this political movement failed, his disciples, in creating Christianity, spiritualized it, theologized it into this message of suffering and redemption. So much of early Christianity for Reimarus is deceptive, because Christians took the political message of Jesus of Nazareth and made it into this spiritual message that wasn't about the reestablishment of a physical kingdom. Again, there's no historical support for this, but Reimarus doesn't want to believe that Jesus actually rose from the dead, that Jesus is who the Gospels say he was and is. And so, this is what he's trying to do in all of this. Another individual in the 19th century that's pretty important in all this is a man named David Strauss, who wrote a work called Life of Jesus, which was published in the 1830s. And so he said that the best way to understand the Gospels is to understand them as myths, which was a way to approach the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, in the 1800s as well. A myth was a story whose value was in its religious and philosophical points and not in its historicity. Right? And so he's trying to say that the documents are still valuable, but they are valuable not for a literal or historical understanding to actually assume that Jesus did miracles, turned water to wine, walked across water, fed 5,000 people with just a few loaves of bread and a couple of fish. Those kind of things shouldn't be understood historically, but it's instead the myth of Jesus that's important, because there's values and there's ideas and philosophical points that can be drawn out of this story to help us be better people. And so, this is what becomes important for Strout, is the myth, not the historicity. And so, these thinkers in this first quest for the historical Jesus, there will be essentially 3 quests for the historical Jesus, they inspire a lot of liberal Christians who are already kind of thinking on these lines anyway, already concerned with the amount of miracles found in the New Testament, especially the Gospels. And so, they look at this as a way to hold on to modern ideas, hold on to science, yet also hold on to some Christian ideas, hold on to some Christian values. And so this notion that you're trying to find something to have rational faith in. Discoveries and works in the early 20th century, however, brought this first quest somewhat to a conclusion. And the primary one of all of this is a work by Albert Schweitzer called The Quest of the Historical Jesus. Schweitzer was a medical doctor. He also had a doctorate in philosophy and theology. Was also a musician, right? So he is very well educated. And one of the things that he pointed out, and looking at Reimarus and Strauss and other people who set out to tell the life of Jesus, is that in so doing, the Jesus in this works, the so-called historical Jesus these people are discovering, are simply a projection of whatever the author values. And so Jesus tends to confirm the author's own presuppositions, right? So if you're a communist, whoa, what do you know? The historical Jesus was a communist too. If you're urging political action, you know what? It just so happens Jesus was a political figure too, politically active, right? So people are reading themselves back into the narrative and attempting to find this historical Jesus that they're looking for. So, Schweitzer points out that this isn't really Jesus we're seeing as much as it is we're seeing these people, kind of trying to put their theology into the mouth of Jesus. While Germans were questioning dogma, doctrine, divinity, Catholics were reconceptualizing it. Now, one of the prime figures in Catholicism for a long time has been Mary. And Mary has had a prime place in Catholicism and Orthodox Christianity for centuries. Way back in the 5th century, she was referred to as Theotokos, the God-bearer, because she had given birth to Jesus, and Jesus, of course, being God, and so she was the mother of God. Well, in the 19th century, there was a promulgation of a new conception of Mary, specifically an immaculate conception of Mary. Specifically, this was the idea that Mary had been born without original sin. So the Immaculate Conception refers to Mary's birth, not Jesus's. And so Mary is born without original sin so that she doesn't pass original sin on to Jesus. And Jesus is not born with original sin. This was promulgated as doctrine by Pius IX in 1854 in the work Ineffabilis Deus. And it's really the only dogma, that has developed outside of a church council in Catholicism. Other people have been supporting this idea since the Middle Ages, but it's really the 19th century where it becomes an official dogma of the church. And, there's a lot of support here because there's a lot of people that, really loved Mary in Catholicism. Now, it's not officially accepted by Anglicans, Orthodox, Protestants, but there were even people among those groups that believed Mary was born without original sin, in order for Jesus to be born. certainly there are groups that deny the existence of original sin to begin with, and so they don't have a problem one way or the other with all of this. So certainly it has nothing to do with this idea, but they wouldn't necessarily support this idea because it's a Catholic idea. The acceptance of this doctrine was helped by a series of Marian apparitions in Lourdes, France, where Mary is said to have visited and appeared to a young girl named Bernadette. At the age of 14, the first of her supposed apparitions, she hears a noise like a gust of wind, turns and sees this kind of hollow in the rock. Eventually it will become a grotto, and there's a woman standing in there. And she goes in and discovers that this is Mary, and Mary will appear up to 18 times to her. And she identifies herself to Bernadette as the Immaculate Conception. I am the Immaculate Conception. And so here is Mary supposedly appearing to this young girl and confirms this doctrine that the Pope is trying to get confirmed. And Mary asks for a chapel to be built there, provides a spring of water for a fountain for Bernadette there, and people start to believe that the water in this grotto at Lourdes has healing power, and people still today will travel to Lourdes because of this vision, believing that the water in the grotto has power there. And so, you have this kind of belief in the innocence of children combined with Mary's statement, I am the Immaculate Conception, that legitimates this doctrine that Mary was born without original sin. Another Catholic doctrine developing at the same time, or in several decades later, I should say, is the doctrine of papal infallibility. In 1869, Pius IX calls for a worldwide council to meet in the city of Rome at the Vatican. This is the first worldwide council since the Council of Trent during the Protestant Reformation. So almost over 300 years have passed since the last time there has been a worldwide council. And the council is originally to talk about modernism, means to counter naturalism, how to respond to the new political situations like the French Revolution and other types of things like that. Now, in this council, Eastern Orthodox and Protestants are invited to come as well, but the invitations are not worded very well, and so it often came off as being insulting rather than inviting, but there were some Protestants and Orthodox Christians there. Word leaks out that one of the ideas to be presented was the doctrine of papal infallibility, which was accepted. Now, when you hear papal infallibility, a lot of people have really a wrong conception of what this doctrine is for Catholics. Essentially, the doctrine is very, very limited in scope. The Pope is only infallible when speaking ex cathedra, or from the chair, from the throne. This does not mean that the Pope is sinless. It does not mean that he's consistently inspired by God. And it's only applicable in certain situations where he is speaking as the public and official head of the church. Only when he is speaking related to a statement of faith or morals. Only when his teaching is the final word on a subject that has undergone discussion. And it is intended to be binding on the whole church, right? So that's when infallibility takes place. Now, realistically, the church had been understood as infallible for centuries within Catholicism. But the Pope was infallible was a rather new, that idea too could also be found, but that people would accept it is something new to the 19th century. The only doctrine that seems to have been promulgated and promoted and accepted under papal infallibility was the Assumption of Mary. This is a doctrine that Mary did not die, but was bodily taken into heaven, right? So she's just kind of ascends into heaven in her body, much like Jesus does at the beginning of Acts. And so that seems to be the only one that has really been, especially since Vatican I, but then that's the only time the Pope has spoken infallibly. Now, some Catholic theologians have gone back and looked at previous popes who did not claim infallibility and said, well, this doctrine that they promoted was infallible because it meets these situations. But infallibility as a doctrine has only been around since the 19th century, and so this is kind of reading back into the historical record. A sizable number of the American bishops do not agree with this. They don't support it. They don't vote for it. But eventually they will acquiesce to the idea that the Pope is infallible in this very limited way and in very limited situations. So we finish up with doctrine in the 19th century. After spring break, we'll pick up again with the 19th century, and we'll be talking about practice.